Oh, you're good.
Okay.
I can see.
All right, you guys, this is Rachel Cassidy with the State Division of Drinking Water. This is our monthly webinar. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. We're good? Okay. Okay, so it is 2:30, and we have a speaker, but he's a little bit late, so I'm just gonna go ahead and blab on until he gets here, hopefully soon. Okay, so again, my name is Rachel, and I'm joined by Colt Smith. We're both in the rules section at the Division of Drinking Water, and this is our 30-minute webinar, and at the end, in the comment section, you'll see a link where you can get CEUs for watching the webinar. So it's just 0.02 CEUs, but they add up over time. Oh, and we do have our guest speaker almost here. So I'm going to go ahead and just fill you in on what I wanted to fill you in on. Some quick reminders from the division. The first is if you're in need of CEUs, and we are getting towards the end of the year, just pay attention to the training calendars. We have our division training calendar that's online. Rural Water, RCAC, AWWA, there's still a lot of opportunities to get CEUs. So check out the training calendar. Another note, and that is that lead copper sampling season is almost over. You can sample lead and copper between June 1st and September 30th. So please pay attention to that. And if you do need to get your lead and copper samples done, please be aware that we go by the date the sample is taken. So if you take them on September 30th and we get the results on October 15th or October 30th, that's fine. By rule, we're not allowed to check for compliance until later. So just make sure that if it's due this year, that you take it at least before or on September 30th. Next thing, your total coliform sampling plans are also due September 30th. Many of you have been calling because you have submitted them, but we haven't noted that on your monitoring schedule. We've been short-staffed for a little bit since John Okeson retired, but we have a new person in our sections. Pete Kears has transferred from field services over, and he will be marking those. So we're a little bit behind on notifying you guys that that's been done as far as taking that requirement off of your monitoring schedule, but never fear, we're getting caught up. So just be patient with us. Next thing is that September 30th is the end of the third calendar quarter of the year. And the end of the calendar quarters, if you purchase water that is chlorinated or you are chlorinating the water yourself, adding any type of chlorine, those quarterly residuals are due by October 10th. And we're a lot more strict, as I'm sure you've noticed this year, on making sure we get that data on time. The best way to make sure that you do not get a violation for not submitting your residuals is by using the online form, and that link is right here. So screenshot this, come back to it, this tiny.cc/MRDL, make that one of your bookmarks. You need to be submitting them, and you can still submit them on the paper forms, but the best way to make sure you're not going to get a violation is to submit them using the online link. If you need help with the online link, give us a call. We can walk you through it. A couple more reminders. The Rural Water organization has a conservation certification that's October 26th and 27th in Salt Lake. Changes in staff at the division. Dallin Frank is new in the rules implementation section. So he works in my group, and he's very busy with making sure that our compliance monitoring data portal is up and running and pretty much doing everything else. We've already swamped him, and he's only been here a couple weeks. Deani, as many of you have worked with her, Deani was in field services section. She's moved to another area of the Department of Environmental Quality, so you won't be working with her anymore for CEUs, but you can still work with Donnie and Kim Dykes. And then Pete Kears was in the field services section, but he's now in the rural section replacing John Okeson, as I had mentioned earlier. Another question that we've been getting that I wanted to address is questions about can you go back and watch all of these monthly webinars and get CEUs for the past year that we've almost been doing it. We started in January. The answer to that question is we're going to keep the CEUs open for the past 6 months. So you can watch the April through actually March through September webinars and take the quiz and get the CEUs. But prior to the March one, we'll probably won't be able to get those CEUs. So keep that in mind.
And if those are not active, because we were shutting them down sooner, you can shoot me an email and I can reactivate them. I don't know that all of those are still live, because we were just going to go 1 month at a time, but now that we're doing 6 months, I don't know that all of them are up and running.
You know, they're on our webpage, the front page. So we'll have to double check that. Anyway, if you have questions, here's our email addresses. Colt Smith is acsmith@utah.gov. I'm rcassidy@utah.gov if you have questions on that. So you guys, that's all the housekeeping I've got. And our illustrious speaker is here. I'm excited to introduce Tage Flint. He is here to talk to us about the governor's recommended state water strategy. So do you want to switch spots with me?
I can stay right here.
Okay, all right.
I'll give him a mouse. Or you just want to move slides for him. There you go.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, good afternoon. Again, Tage Flint here. My day job is the General Manager, CEO of Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District. However, I've fulfilled another role over the last 4 years, and that is one of the co-chairs, one of the 3 co-chairs of the governor's state water strategy team. And it's hard to believe it's been 4 years, but not in one respect. On another respect, it seems like it's been all of 4 years to try to come to a concluding document, which we've done. And as you can see on the screen, there's a picture of at least some of the ultimate team that worked on this process through those years. And that actually is the end of the story, where we were able to give that document to the governor just a few months ago in the middle of July. So I thought I'd give a little perspective here in terms of where we've been and what a water strategy is and what the governor intended for that. Some 4 years ago, the governor asked what he called the Gang of Six, which were 6 of us, to travel around the state and receive public comment about water issues. And they ranged really from retail water needs for drinking water throughout the towns and cities of the state, to agricultural needs and issues going on in terms of water around the state, and then water rights, water infrastructure for delivering of this water to all those needs. All those kinds of things were discussed at length in these town hall meetings. We had 8 of them, and we literally went from one end of the state to the other, from Logan to Price to St. George, Layton, Salt Lake, Richfield, and I'm sure I'm going to miss a couple, where we received a lot of comment, about 800 online comments and dozens of comments at the meetings themselves. We culminated that first year of activity with some white papers that were written by each of the 6 of us to summarize what we had heard. That really acted as a catalyst for Governor Herbert, who wanted then to do a deeper dive into what should we do in the state of Utah about water needs going forward, looking into the future. And so that second year, instead of just culminating with the white papers, he decided to appoint a larger advisory committee, and with the following objectives shown on the screen there, including develop a 50-year water plan, which is very ambitious, I might add, to have a 50-year water plan for an entire state, but still that was what the ask was. He solicited potential water management strategies from this group. What are the strategies going to do going forward? We wanted lots of public feedback in addition to what we'd already received, and then we wanted to give kind of a laundry list of you, a set of strategies the governor could use to move forward. As you've probably heard by now, Governor Herbert is very interested in making sure that the state stays economically viable and make sure that we have sufficient jobs and comforts for the citizens that are going to be here in the future. We also worked in conjunction with Envision Utah, another nonprofit organization that was doing work for planning of the state in terms of water, air quality, transportation, and the like. So we kind of had two hats for this group. I might add that group grew to a group of 41 to be exact, and represented a very wide spectrum of interests in the state. We had certainly a couple of legislators that were on that list. We had those who represented the environmental community from organizations such as Audubon Society, Friends of Great Salt Lake, and the like. And then we had water managers and water purveyors. We had those representing agriculture. We had those representing industry, and a lot of other interests in that group of 41. So you might imagine that wasn't something that we could just meet with a couple of times and come to conclusions. There were a lot of different opinions, a lot of different points of view. With that, though, we looked at a process, and the process, instead of trying to bore everyone by reading all of this slide, it's very busy. I've just point you to the top titles, which is how we went about our work for over 2 years. And that was, we established some baseline assumptions from which all of us could work, and we all agreed were the assumptions we would deal with throughout the process. And they would include something like Utah's population will approximately double by 2060. That in and of itself is a daunting statistic, to think that every place we now live will be at least double that size by 2060. Nonetheless, the new population projections still bear that out as being the likelihood. After that, we started asking very broad but important questions regarding water strategy in the state. And that would be such as the one listed there: how will we supply water to 5 million Utahns? Or over 5 million Utahns, while right now we're dealing with just 3 million. And then we broke those questions into issues, and then finally into methods that we later called recommendations, so that we could get to addressing the actual question that was asked. So with that much background, I'll jump into the process. The process for us was a year ago this month. In fact, almost a year ago today, we presented as co-chairs a straw man, or a draft, summarizing what our meetings had discussed up to that time. And then we broke out those 41 people into different drafting groups, and each of those groups took a key policy question and really went into the weeds with it to see if we could make recommendations coming back out. After that, we sought public comment to a draft that was made from those drafting committees, and then we did revisions one more time, and then finally came up with a finalized water strategy that we submitted to Governor Herbert. That tends to minimize the process. I can't tell you how many meetings and hundreds of hours that took to get to that point with this group, and over the phone and via emails and in person. A lot of people on that group deserve a lot of credit for spending so much time and trying to do this in a collaborative way. Folks from all points of view on this group could have easily gone to their corners and been very defensive of their positions, but they weren't. They actually got together and tried to work out some issues, which was very encouraging. The book looks like that physically on the screen there. It has an executive summary. It has a lot of background. Would encourage you to get a copy or look at the copy on the webpage. And I do not have that with me, but I hope it's on the last page. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. We will get that address to you so you can pull this document up.
On our website too.
When we ended up with 11 key policy questions that we wanted to address, and the first one, and not by accident, to be number one, was the role of water conservation in Utah. And you've heard the statistics before. We're one of the top per capita users of water in the nation. That isn't because we're just inherently wasters in this state. It's because we have a climate that coincides with the need for additional water use to irrigate and have other uses of water. But I'm going to cut right to the quick on each one of these. After stating the question, we'll review the recommendations. In this case, for water conservation, we want to first and foremost prioritize it as what I would call a water development project. We talk about water development as water managers a lot of times as going out and building new facilities and maybe making new reservoirs. But really, if we cut substantially the per capita use of our citizens, we all of a sudden end up with a block of water that we can now apply to the next generation of Utahns, and becomes very much a water development project. We want to be able to measure how we're doing in water conservation and how we compare to others. This is very difficult, and there's a lot of discussion in the document about how we do not compare apples to apples very well, one state to another, and how we measure our water use. And so it's largely unfair for an outsider to say, compare Utah to Las Vegas. For starters, we're comparing a state to a city. And secondly, the ways that we measure and how they measure their water use is probably entirely different. And so we need to get to some sort of commonality on how we measure our water use. We certainly want to identify the constraints of intended and unintended consequences. Not all water conservation programs yield a good environmental result, where if we, for instance, if we do reuse projects in the wrong place, we might very well be impacting downstream water users. And certainly we want to be able to use that as a contributing factor to our water supply going forward, probably the largest. Second question we looked at is how will diverted water supplies be developed to meet the increasing needs? We know that there's a finite amount of water in Utah, and we know that there's only a finite amount that can be diverted from any one stream or other water body or underground aquifer. And so how is it we're going to optimize these and develop these so that we have enough water for all that's involved in the state? This is another hotly contested and discussed item in our book. But certainly we want to manage and restore the watersheds. That comes along with just having a better water yield and a better water quality yield coming out of our watersheds. And there's much to be discussed there in forestry management of federal lands. We saw what happened down in Iron County this year with the fires, and much discussion to be had on making sure our watersheds stay healthy and improved over what they are now. We want to be able to develop the interstate rivers and other regional water supplies. And what that really means is there are two interstate rivers that in which Utah has water rights, the Bear River and the Colorado River, not fully developed or utilized by Utahns right now, that ought to be looked at in the future for additional water supplies. In the case of the Bear River, there's some acknowledgement that that project has been moved way back on the calendar, probably definitely 3-4 decades from now, before that need starts arising because of good conservation participation by our citizens. The Colorado River development continues in the form of the Central Utah Project, but certainly is being widely discussed under the Lake Powell Pipeline project in the south, where water could be brought to Kane and Washington counties. So that one needs to be vetted with a lot of environmental processes and other processes that will take decades to develop. Nonetheless, it's still on the list of something that we have to preserve options for. Increase ASR, our aquifer storage and recovery programs, is something we want to do more in Utah. We're restoring additional water underground in existing aquifers. And then we want to be able to quantify very well what the costs and benefits of water development, and certainly the detriments to water development as well as we go along. We'll talk about those in a minute. How long do we?
As long as you,
okay, I won't kill you with hours of a presentation here.
No, we're lucky to have you, so take all the time you want.
Okay, thank you. Those little critters on the screen are brine shrimp out of the Great Salt Lake, an industry that we don't talk a lot about, but certainly a thriving industry on the lake itself. The question that we addressed here was, what do we do to preserve natural systems in the face of increasing water demands? Here we have an increasing population. Water demands are going to rise with that population, although we're trying to reduce all the while our per capita use. What about the natural systems from which we are drawing all of our water supply? It's a very important question, and something that I think every one of the 41 on the group were concerned with, to be sure that we aren't detrimentally impacting the natural systems beyond repair. The recommendations that came from that large discussion was improve the science and conservation planning and funding around these watersheds to be sure that they are healthy and make sure that we're doing the right thing. And when I say watersheds, that could include natural lakes, streams, aquifers, and the like. We need to have a bigger toolbox, if you will, to be able to provide in-stream flows in streams so that more fisheries can thrive. As an example, several of the federal water projects in the state have minimum stream flow releases out of reservoirs, and they are the only reason that the rivers are running from top to bottom, and blue ribbon trout fisheries have been created. That tool needs to be continued to expand so that we can help those fisheries along the way. We want to be able to at least discuss the creation of a trust depository, if you will, for water rights that can be used for these in-stream flow purposes for the fish and wildlife. We want to be able to study the risks and certainly the benefits of more efficient water delivery, how it is we become more efficient and not lose so much in our losses. So that's just a snapshot of what's in this key policy question about the environment. Next one was, how do we protect our water quality in Utah? It's certainly one that we want to pay attention to. We don't want a degradation of water quality. Here's the good news. Over the last couple of decades, we've actually gotten better. By and large, in the state of Utah, our water quality is better than it used to be. Been a lot of work on point source remediation and other sources that have contributed to the degradation of our water supplies, and they've been cleaned up with a lot of different federal and state and local programs. So we're going in the right direction, but we certainly want to do more. The recommendations here included we want to still be able to address the nutrient and salinity problems in our reservoirs in particular. Because we still have algae problems. You may have seen or read about those in the newspapers of late. My impression of that is that we really don't have much of a different algae problem than we had a decade ago. It's just that we're paying more attention to it than we used to. Invasive species, quagga mussels is the one you hear most about. We don't want those little critters in our lakes. Once they get established in our lakes, they're virtually impossible to kill, and they raise havoc on infrastructure. Pipelines, intakes, marinas, boat docks, those kinds of things. And so we want to step up that control contingent. We want to be able to fund the infrastructure that's needed to upgrade our wastewater plants so that, again, the water that's being released back into the natural system is better than it has been in the past. We're making great strides there and want to do some more. Water quality to protect the Great Salt Lake. The Great Salt Lake and how it's viewed is entirely different than it was just a few decades ago, where it's a dead sea in the bottom of a basin, but has a very unique ecosystem that needs to be protected. And water quality is a big part of what's going into protecting that water body. And we certainly want to talk about non-point sources as being something we want to pay attention to as well, and not just those that have a one site contribution to the stream. A big one that we discussed, and believe me, there was a lot of discussion and back and forth on this one, is what are we going to do with our weather patterns if they do indeed change and the climate impacts our water supply going forward. Most all scientific models now that are not controlled, but at least reviewed by our state climatologist, as well as the Colorado River Basin team, agree that we are headed for a warmer climate than we've had in the past on the average, and probably in most of Utah, a little more rain, a little less snow, maybe not as much difference in precipitation. This is what form it comes in. Nonetheless, these have big effects on water supply going forward. So the recommendations, including we need to coordinate with the government, both local, federal, and state governments, and make sure our climate research is as best as we can get and as good as we can get at the time, so we can assess further what the results are going to be going forward, and then we can identify our vulnerabilities going forward. I can tell you if it's just a small amount, or I mean as little as 20% less snow and comes in the form of rain, we are going to have to review our entire storage process in the state and how we store at reservoirs right now, because we're likely not to have enough storage to deliver the same amount of water we deliver now out of those facilities. We need to identify mitigation strategies so that we're prepared and ahead of the curve here, so we're not constantly dealing with just crisis coming from this issue. And we are talking about a matter of decades, not centuries, as the effects of these things start coming upon us based on what we're seeing in the models. Climate research specific to the state of Utah and more specifically to the rivers within Utah needs to be enhanced, so that we're not using just west-wide models or Colorado River Basin models to predict what's going to happen in our individual waterways in Utah. So a lot more work to be done there. What's the role of policymakers and elected officials in our state? We think that's an important one, as government is going to have oversight. In areas such as these listed here, we need to create opportunities for policymakers to be informed on the issues of water. A lot of times water issues are not right at the top of the policymaker list, in that we're out of sight and out of mind. Most anybody that would listen to this understands that. Most of our facilities are buried, and we're a little bit taken for granted until we have a problem. And so we need an ongoing learning opportunity for our policymakers. We need to be able to have tools with which the decision makers go through the process on water. It's very complex. The whole water law system that we have here in the state, and any place in the West really, is incredibly complex, and it's going to take some time to get to the right decisions. We want to be able to talk with one another, interagency water decisions. Certainly the big water districts, like the one I represent, or the municipalities, or the smaller systems, all need to engage in some discussion and dialogue along the way, so we don't leave anybody behind and that we don't miss something along the way. And we certainly want to be able to, if we can, settle the federal reserved water right claims with the tribes, with other federal water projects in the state. We certainly want to get those concluded so that we can quantify what we have going forward. Don't want to leave out science and technology and how that's going to address our future water needs. I'm sure many of you experienced what I've experienced, and that is just in the last few years, technology has changed how we purvey water. And that could come in the form of how we meter. AMI systems give us minute by minute feedback on what we're doing for water use in our communities. It could be, like the picture shows here, it could be innovations in large water purveyance and water treatment that really changed the game for us in terms of water purveyance. Here we have in the picture, by the way, is a heat map, if you will, of water use in a neighborhood in my district, where the green depicts those who are now using less than their allotted amount of water, those in yellow about right at their allotment, and those in red still using well over their allotment. and we can start now measuring parcel by parcel who's using the most water, who's using the least, and who does a good job of being efficient. That tool right there was not available to us just 8 years ago. And so you can see where science and technology can really help us assess where we're going. The recommendations included, we want to be able to test water treatment and ag technologies. Agriculture in the state of Utah uses about 80+% of the diverted water still to this day. And so there's certainly a desire to be more efficient on the agricultural side. Now, efficient on the agricultural side is a two-way stream, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We want to be able to deal with our gray water and our wastewater and look at reuse projects where they make sense, where they don't have a negative impact to the environment, where they don't impact other appropriators on the stream, but still able to use our water more efficiently. We want to be able to minimize our distribution losses. Many of us have distribution systems that still have a lot of leaks and could easily approach 20–30% of our water is lost to the system as it goes to the pipeline systems. I want to be able to assess that better. And we want to be able to understand our groundwater aquifers much better than we do now. Water law in the state of Utah, what framework are we going to look at going forward? It's interesting what we concluded on. And one is we want to be able to go to each river basin in the state and do an adjudication, a legal action that's led by the state engineer to relook at who now is using water and who now has the right to use that water. Been many decades for many of these rivers to now have a good new review is going to be very healthy for the system. We want to be able to strengthen the state engineer's role when he's dealing with change applications and exchange applications and other things in his realm, so that he can make quick decisions and move the process along without any undue delays. We want to be able to do some temporary changes of water so that we can be the most efficient we can in using water in new and helpful ways. We want to be able to help the cities divest of their water, possibly if they have too much and now are nearing their build-out stage and still have too much. Right now, constitutionally, that's a problem. And so we might want to visit that. And we certainly want to be able to have a lot of stakeholders in talking about our water law and policy. Now, what you don't see here is a recommendation for a wholesale change in the water law. That would be an unraveling of what we now know as some order in how we deliver and own water. And it was not the recommendation to try to overhaul the whole system, but just be too disruptive. Okay, so this is Governor Herbert's one of his favorite topics, and that is how are we going to sustain our economy and quality of life for Utah residents with water. And water has all to do with both of those things. If you don't think so, I can give you an example where my district receives calls constantly from folks wanting to know if they should bring their business to Utah and put their headquarters in Utah or put their manufacturing plant in Utah. And the first question on their list almost is it going to be a sufficient water supply, not only for their business, but for their employees who will live here and for their recreation needs along the way. If we answer no or maybe to any of those questions, they tend to close their book and go to the next state. And the governor's well aware of that. So we know that water is a big player in how we move economically into the future. We certainly want the various government levels and climate researchers to help us so that we have the right answers to the questions. What about climate variability? What about climate change? And those kinds of things. And we talked about that earlier, but we certainly want definitive answers, at least the best we can get. We need to know where we're vulnerable and have management strategies ready so that if we do run into a problem, we can handle it and not, again, send signals that our economy is going to suffer. We want our mitigation strategies to include adaptation. So as we see conditions change, we don't do business as usual. Instead, we actually are able to adapt to whatever the new variables are. And we talked about climate research already. We just need to know more about what the climate is going to do. Okay, one that worries water managers like me a lot is how is it we're going to adequately fund and keep up with the infrastructure that we already rely upon in the state of Utah, and how is it we're going to build new infrastructure to supply water to all these people that we think are going to live here. And that's a very unique question for Utahns, I think, because for starters, we are experiencing right now the first time of things wearing out. Most of the state of Utah has facilities that are somewhat younger than 70 or 80 years old, and that's the engineered life of those facilities. Therefore, we are for the first time experiencing them all wearing out. The projected cost of those replacement projects will likely exceed the cost of building new projects in the next several decades. Okay, so recommendations would include we need an advanced plan for our infrastructure so that the state can help us in a role in funding, or at least financing, those new infrastructure projects. That's a role that the state has not been in much, though they have through the revolving loan funds and whatnot. But in a bigger way, is the state ready to do that? The reason we think that's important is because the federal government used to be in the state and many other western states providing financing for big water projects. They've pretty much picked up their briefcase and gone home. And so we have to substitute that with another large overarching interested party. We need to make sure that our water infrastructure is optimized so we get a better return on our investment, so we're not sinking a lot of money into bad infrastructure, and that's certainly a risk, and we want to be able to do that on an engineering basis much better. We need to repair and replace timely. We do not want to operate on the crisis basis where the time for replacing large water infrastructure or even small water infrastructure is when the water is cascading down I-15. Now we want to be able to be ahead of that curve so that we don't experience that crisis. We need better security for our water facilities, both physical security and cybersecurity. I don't know too many agencies at this point that have not been infected by some sort of computer virus by now, or something that really becomes disruptive to the operation of their systems. And we need to be much more diligent in those areas. And we need to talk about energy consumption because it's all tied together. Very little water now is moved throughout the state without an energy profile, and we need to be efficient in doing that. I talked about agriculture a little earlier. We really dove into this topic because of a couple things. Agriculture is still very highly valued by Utahns. The Envision Utah survey that was put out to a very wide range of folks came back overwhelmingly valuing at the top of the list the agricultural lands of Utah. And there's interest in production of food and fiber locally for our citizens. There's also interest in the open space that agriculture provides for us. And certainly there's a heritage or history of agriculture in the state that does not want to be lost. And so there's a lot of discussion about agriculture. We already talked about how much water they use. We want to be able to get more engaged with a broader list of stakeholders on how we deal with agriculture issues going forward in terms of water. We want to be able to preserve our ag lands and water because the Utahns have told us over and over again they want them preserved. And so we need to strike a healthy balance there of what lands and what water go into a next use and which ones remain. Can the agricultural water users contribute more to the water management of the whole river system? We think so, and we need to have them to the table. We need our extension service from Utah State University to be a partner as well as we try to deal with the new water landscape for the state of Utah. And we need to be able to deal with agriculture infrastructure and have real-time data available to them, so when they have a change decision to make, they make it under good information. So with that, I just rifled through 11 of the 11 key policy questions in the document, and there is just a ton more than what I talked about in the last half hour in there. And I would encourage any of you to look this up online and read it in detail, because here's why I think we should. There are snapshots in this document that this is as close to a crystal ball as we'll get for some time, where if you want to know if you run a water system anywhere in the state of Utah and you want to know what the future looks like, this document fairly well encapsulates what issues you're going to deal with going forward, whether that's in infrastructure, the environmental needs, agriculture, growth, population growth, new infrastructure, watersheds. All of it is discussed in here. Now, the three co-chairs, and I need to mention Warren Peterson and Representative Tim Hawks were the other two co-chairs along with me, who tried to somehow corral this large group of differing opinions into a group that could work together. And I think we were successful, at least in that part. This is a very collaborative group in the end. And we appreciate everybody, taking off their defenses a little bit and working together through this. But the three of us have viewed this document as just a starting point. We've now identified the issues. We've now articulated some of the recommendations, but now it's time to go to work. And hats off to Governor Herbert, who just in the last 3 weeks has assembled his staff, and most of them from cabinet members, including the directors of DEQ and Natural Resources, to start down action items now to address some of these recommendations. And so I think you're much more to hear for us in the future on these issues. But if you want an idea where your water business is heading, this will give you a good start.
Question for you on that.
Yes.
As many of the water systems who are listening probably are thinking, well, we've been doing this conservation program. Can they communicate that to this committee and say, hey, we're doing this part of it. What do you think? Recommendations on how we're doing, or if we should ramp it up?
Right. So the committee officially has been disbanded now that they've concluded their work. However, in its place now, the different state agencies are going to take up each one of these recommendations, or at least each one of these key policy questions, including water conservation. Okay. We'll have just a little bit of time here for those assignments to be made, and then that agency will do just what you said. Perfect. They'll receive input on what water conservation programs are being applied in the state. Now, remember, if you're a system of a certain size, you have to already submit a water conservation plan, and this is a great guidance document on where you ought to address your water conservation plans.
Excellent.
We had two questions from the chat room. One of them was, what is the basis? Was the basis of water rights considered? As it now stands, it seems there is no incentive to conserve the same number of acres as the basis, regardless of efficiency. Was that part of the discussion?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we are on prior appropriation law as a model in the state, and it is a little bit of a use or lose process, where if you don't optimize your water right, when these new adjudications that we talked about come through your area, you may get a haircut because of your non-use. Part of the water right discussion in that chapter talks about a mechanism to be better articulated, such that those who put in the effort and expense of making their system more water efficient will have then a reciprocal mechanism to be able to use that water elsewhere, and at least market that water elsewhere, so that there's an incentive built in. It's an excellent question. And there's a lot of discussion, not only in this group before we disbanded, but also ongoing in the legislative executive water rights task force. That is question number one that they're going to address over the next year. So you can track their discussions as well. But I can tell you, most people in the room are looking for a solution of being able to reward the efficient use by allowing the saved water, if you will, to be put to another beneficial use, and to the benefit of the original water right holder. And so, that opens up a whole can of worms in terms of the next appropriator downstream and everything else. That's why it's not easily solved, but look for a lot of discussion, and I think everyone is now engaged in trying to find a solution to that.
And then we have just one more. If you could, you'd mentioned that you thought that we've always had the algal blooms, and just we're doing a better job of noticing them now. Someone wanted you to expound on that just a little bit.
Yeah, there's a little bit of bias on my part here. My agency manages 7 major reservoirs in Utah, in northern Utah, and We have monitored and measured algal blooms in each one of those water bodies and the rivers around them for many decades. And our quantification efforts for algae have shown that analysis have shown that we have not increased much in our algae counts throughout those water bodies. And in fact, in some of those reservoirs, it's gotten better. We've handled our point source use, or point source contributors better, and done a better deal in our TMDL process for those reservoirs. So they've actually increased it. But we've never seen a media attention given to algae like we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And there are a couple of events that triggered that. There were some algae blooms in Utah Lake that got covered quite heavily, although that lake has also had algae in it for as long as I can remember. So I don't want to discount the attention, because I think it gives us a springboard from which we can now address the problem even more in terms of nutrients going into the reservoirs and whatnot. But just my caution for the reservoirs that I manage, we're not seeing increased numbers. We're seeing increased attention, which is not all bad, but we want to make sure we make the distinction.
And I would say, as a regulator, I'll chime in on this one. It came to our attention because of the media scrutiny about the harmful algal blooms. And when we approach the water systems that are vulnerable to a harmful algal bloom, we were happy and pleased to find out that the response was universal, and it was, Division of Drinking Water. We've been dealing with this for 20 years, and here's our management plan, and this is what we've been doing to address it. So we're definitely pleased that it's something that the systems that are vulnerable are mostly used to addressing and dealing with. So we're just getting up to snuff ourselves.
Exactly. It's a good point. Algae quantification and even speciation, so you find out what they are, is extremely difficult, because about the time you get the results back from a laboratory that has that ability, the whole background algae count has changed again, and there might be new species to deal with. We've long sought what we call in situ type of an algal detection method, and they just don't exist, not reliably anyway. And so it's not a bridge too far, but it's still something we haven't conquered yet, and we want to. But in the interim, we just need to make sure that we're on top of what we think is happening on our rivers in terms of and reservoirs in terms of algal counts, and best we can what types, because we know some types are going to discharge an algal toxin that we can't deal with on the drinking water side, or maybe the fish can't deal with in the stream, or certainly anybody visiting the reservoir. And those are all risks, I think, aren't much higher than they ever have been, but certainly more attention has been given to them lately.
Definitely. Yeah, we've learned a lot. I think that's all the questions that we had online. So we will wrap it up here really quick. I just have to mention one thing that I messed up on. CEUs, I mentioned earlier that watching the webinars was 0.02 CEUs. I lied and I apologize. It's been a long day. It's 0.05. But then for this one, because we did extend it to be able to listen to the entire report, probably be a little bit longer, more CEUs than that. So anyway, the link below will direct you to the quiz. And then we're also including in that the link to the report.
That's not there yet. We'll get there.
We'll get there.
We'll
Be
get
patient. Give us an hour.
Give me an hour to put that
There you
on.
go.
But you might have to just click the show more, and then there'll be some linkage that says link to CEUs, and they'll take you to there.
Excellent. So we appreciate you attending, and we encourage everybody listening to subscribe. You can watch this on YouTube on your phone. Don't do it while you're driving, but you can. You can. It's just training that we want to stay in touch and provide to you every month. So subscribe to the channel. And the next webinar is scheduled to be October 23rd at 11 a.m. and RCAC will come talk to us.
It's the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and they're going to come talk about their program in Utah and what they've done.
Okay. Yeah, and that'll conclude us for today. So you guys have a safe rest of the month and into October. Get your residuals into me by the 10th, and we'll see you in October. Thank you. Thank you, Tage.
Thank you. Thanks for
Appreciate
having
it.
me.